the Arlesdale Railway now bringing the fresh produce down from the farms, the engines of the Little Western were finding themselves worked off their wheels. Extra trains had to be laid on for the fresh produce, and the engines were finding they barely had any time to catch their breath. One afternoon, Duck was catching a rare moment of rest. He looked up as an unfamiliar engine approached on the next track over.
It's Barry, isn't it?
Yes, I believe you're, Duck?
That's right,
Duck replied.
I've been told you need some help with the harvest traffic here.
A knowing grin crossed Duck's face.
I should have known the Fat Controller would arrange something.
A bit more than something, Duck, said a familiar voice. Duck looked over, spotting the Fat Controller, who had just climbed down from Barry's cab. As you've already heard, Barry is here to help with the increased workload. However, this is only temporary.
I understand the harvest traffic will only be for a few more weeks, sir,
Duck said. The Fat Controller chuckled. That's not quite what I meant, Duck. Do you remember when we had Wilbert here last year?
Yes,
Duck replied, thinking of the austerity tank engine who'd visited. He had shown himself to be a hard worker, and the engines had enjoyed having him around.
Do you mean to say you've bought one of Wilbert's brothers, sir?
I have indeed. I'm afraid the engine I was originally looking at is no longer available. However, this one will be able to come here, but not for a couple of weeks. Barry will be helping until then.
Thank you, sir. This will make things easier for us.
Barry grinned.
Then I'd better set to work. I believe there's a train of produce to pick up from Osborough?
Yes. If you could take it, that would save Donald a trip.
Of course,
Barry replied. Duck departed a moment later, taking the Fat Controller back to Tidmouth with him. Later that evening, Barry brought a train into Tidmouth, stopping next to where Oliver was taking on some coal. He glanced over.
Oliver, can I ask you something?
Of course,
Oliver replied.
The last time I was here, you mentioned you'd been saved from scrap too. I heard Douglas's story earlier, but I don't think I've heard yours.
it's quite a story.
Oliver said. He explained how he'd gone on the run, hiding from diesels, ending up in the scrapyard, and being rescued by Douglas.
You were only in the scrapyard for one day?
Yes, but it was the worst day I'd ever had. I don't know how you managed to last 20 years on a scrap siding.
Barry's face fell.
It wasn't a choice,
He said. But a moment later, he realized that wasn't strictly true. Oliver had been in the same position as him, as had Douglas, in a way. But where those two had taken action, Barry had just given up, and allowed himself to be sent to the Woodham Brothers scrapyard.
Barry? Are you alright?
Oliver asked, breaking through the other engine's thoughts.
Huh? Oh, yes, thank you.
Barry replied, and he chuffed off without another word. Early the next morning, Duck arrived at Knapford with a passenger train.
Are you alright, Duck? You look a bit worried.
Alice asked from the other platform, as the Great Western engine brought his train to a halt.
I'm just a bit puzzled about Barry,
Duck said.
Yesterday, he seemed to be rather chatty. I mean, he was talking to Donald and Douglas about their run down from Scotland only yesterday afternoon. But in the sheds last night, you could barely get a word out of him.
Alice frowned, worried. On his previous visit, Barry had been struggling to get over the 20 years he'd spent on the scrap siding. On one of her branch line flyer runs, Alice had convinced him to open up about that experience.
I'll talk to him, see if he's alright.
Alice said, as she departed. Alice soon arrived at Tidmouth. Leaving her train at the platform, she moved forward to the water tower. She had a 15-minute stop scheduled here to allow her to have a drink. As she'd hoped, Barry was taking on cold in the yard.
Hello, Barry.
She called,
I heard you were visiting us again. How are you?
Much better, Alice. Thanks in no small part to you. As you said, my volunteers are quite supportive.
Barry said, and he smiled wryly.
Most of the other engines on my edited trail have been through similar experiences themselves. They were able to help too.
Alice grinned.
I'm glad to hear you've been able to move on.
Barry hesitated for a moment before replying.
Yes, I suppose I have.
Is there anything you're still having difficulty with?
Alice asked gently, thinking of what Duck had told her earlier.
Well, only since I got here. I didn't really have a proper chance to talk to Douglas and Oliver last time, but I've heard they went on the run from Scrap. It just makes me wonder if I could have done the same.
I understand where you're coming from. To be honest, Barry, I did consider the same question myself when Oliver told me his story. But what I realised was that he and Douglas are the exception. What you and I went through, being pulled from the sidings at the last minute, was a normal experience for those of us lucky enough to be saved.
Yes, but I've spoken to other engines on my heritage railway. All of them asked their crews to get in touch with heritage services. But I didn't. I feel there was a bit of a pushover.
I think you're underestimating yourself, Barry.
Maybe.
Barry replied. Before Alice could say any more, Barry backed off to collect his trucks. He was still thinking about it when he reached Alsdale with the empty ballast trucks. As Barry backed down onto the loaded ones, Rex looked over from the Alsdale Railway's tracks.
You'll want to be careful, Barry. According to Donald, those are some of the worst trucks on the line.
The miniature engine warned.
Thank you, Rex.
Barry replied. Once his driver had coupled him up, he departed. Barry kept Rex's warning in mind as he headed along the line, but the trucks seemed to be coming along quietly. What he couldn't hear over the sound of the rain was that they were whispering and plotting amongst themselves. "Hold back on the hill! Hold back on the hill!" they were murmuring to each other. Soon, Barry passed through Ultra and began the long climb towards Clifton. This was where the trucks decided to play their trick. They held back with all their weight, and Barry could feel his train getting heavier.
Come on, come on!
He chuffed. He could hear the trucks giggling behind him.
Oh no, I no pushover. Driver, could you drop some sand, please?
There you go, Barry.
Replied his driver. A moment later, the Welsh engine felt the coarse sand under his wheels, and he dug in, determined to show those trucks who was in charge.
Go on then,
Teased the trucks.
you won't be able to pull us.
We'll see about that.
Barry replied, and he heaved forwards. He'd let himself down once before, and he wasn't going to do it again. One way or another, Barry thought, he was going to get those trucks to Tidman. After a few more minutes, Barry reached the top of the hill. By this point, the trucks had had enough of the struggle and gave up. They didn't give him any more trouble, and he smoothly headed along the line. Later that evening, Barry joined the other engines at the Callan sheds. "You sounded like you were having a wee bit of trouble with those ballast trucks this morning."
I was, yes. They decided to try one of their little tricks.
"I could hear you from the far side of Clifton, Barry. You sounded pretty determined. Almost as though you were trying to prove a point." Barry didn't say anything for a moment.
I think maybe I was.
He replied, but he didn't elaborate. "You were? Prove it to who?" Duck asked.
Myself, really.
Silence fell over the sheds. The other engines didn't quite know what to make of this. Then, Oliver remembered his earlier conversation with Barry.
I think I see what you mean.
He said, thinking of the restored engine's reaction to his story. A few evenings later, the Fat Controller came to see the Little Western engines. "Good evening, engines. I'm afraid I've got good and bad news." All 5 engines looked curiously at him.
What would that be, sir?
"The good news is that the new tank engine will be arriving tomorrow." The engines smiled, then Barry frowned.
Then, would I be correct, sir, in saying that the bad news is that I'll be leaving?
"I'm afraid so, Barry," replied the Fat Controller. The engines' faces fell, then Barry spoke again.
"All good things must come to an end, I suppose."
He looked over at the other engines.
"Well, I had a fantastic time."
I'm glad to hear it.
Thank you for helping out.
"I'm glad I could."
Barry glanced down at the Fat Controller.
"Sir, if you ever need an extra set of wheels."
"You'll be the first engine I call, Barry." Barry grinned. "You'd better be going, Barry. Your Heritage Railway is expecting you back." Barry whistled and departed, accompanied by a chorus of whistles from the other engines. Once he'd gone, the 4 Little Western engines looked inquiringly at the Fat Controller.
Do you know what time the new engine will be arriving tomorrow, sir?
"Sheffield, as he's called, has already left his Heritage Railway. He'll be here around 9 o'clock. The Scottish twins exchanged a look. "Sheffield, eh? That's an interesting name." "Aye, he may be an interesting fellow," Donald replied.
I guess we'll find out tomorrow, Doc said.
But still, they couldn't help wondering what the new engine would be like.